not a quote-unquote Deltarune YouTuber. And, okay, I'm actually not even a YouTuber in general, and neither do I want to be. But this is especially the case for Deltarune, because I'm just a regular RPG enjoyer who's been feasting on all these recent RPG announcements from the various gaming showcases in June, and saw that the release date for Deltarune Chapter 5 is insanely soon. Like geez, Toby Fox wasn't entirely honest when he said second half of 2026. And so I thought, hey, I enjoyed my time with Deltarune, especially last year's release, but even though I'm not a Giga fan or some pre-established in-depth lore YouTuber or whatever, why not just throw my hat in the ring and talk about some predictions I've been thinking about in regards to this chapter. And I guess the chapter being released so soon is, I guess, forcing my hand into actually bothering to finish this video. Because I was not expecting this release to be so soon, and this trailer is already confirming a bunch of predictions I have been thinking for Chapter 5, such as there being some kind of Japanese influence in the Dark World for this chapter, due to the festival, with the festival itself likely taking some influence from Japanese festivals. And even that crazy shot of solo Chris fight against what looks to be an exact replica of an attack from one of the final bosses of Undertale, like, I would have loved to have gotten this video out before this trailer, because if this is what I think it is, I predicted that too. More on that later. Okay, so basically for this video, will basically be me predicting the sort of basic general outline for what I think Chapter 5 will be like, with some more specific and relevant predictions here and there. And I'll be approaching most of these ideas from the concept of them being, well, ideas. Like how the story's played out thus far and what story I believe will need to be told next. This is conceptually the kind of thing I would imagine Chapter 5 to be like, given the information we've been presented with. Think of it kind of like a pitch for Chapter 5, I guess you could say. I'm not going to be kicking and screaming if barely anything I mentioned in this video actually ends up being in the chapter, because barely anything I was thinking for Chapter 3 and 4 ended up happening either. Same thing with Chapter 2, for better or worse. These are really just things I think would be neat, but being put all together into a somewhat believable, possible Chapter 5, quote unquote. Like, I'm not just going to list thing after thing that couldn't possibly all happen in one chapter, like I've seen some people talk about Chapter 3, and how many predictions people had for that chapter and what they expected out of it when it was never bound to have everything people were expecting, because otherwise it would be like a 20-hour chapter. But I've been saying a lot of preamble, let's actually start talking about my ideas slash predictions slash pitch, or whatever you call it. I guess it's more of a concept. But before talking about what first happens as soon as you boot up the game or whatever, there's some big questions for this chapter as a whole, regarding its place in the story. Chapter 6 and 7 should presumably be the climax of the game, and given what we know about Deltarune regarding things like the prophecy and other plot threads, I really think it's quite likely that we could see Chapter 6 really heavily involving the Roaring in the shelter. Perhaps the Roaring occurring during Hometown's festival, leading everyone into the shelter while the player uses all that they've learnt in the brief bit of knowledge from certain encounters in Chapter 4 to face off against some very strong Titan-based enemies and hold things off, before they too have to retreat into the shelter as well. And that's where the real climax of the game begins, where things move beyond just being about the prophecy with 3 heroes and things become much more unexpected and potentially even meta. More than likely finally looping back around to the strange meta survey program stuff way back from Deltarune's very beginning. AKA, Chapter 6 will become very serious and perhaps even darker. There's not going to be time to do silly side stuff in Castletown, and yeah, I'm very confident that that will be the very vague outline for Chapter 6. But that's Chapter 6. What about 5? What things need to be done within this game in between Chapter 4 and the game's climax? What would be the ideal tone to slip in between the endgame climax and the mid-game semi-climax of sorts? Well, I think this chapter would need to be something more of a breather and more low-key. Perhaps something that can lift up your spirits just a little bit, but still not making you forget what happened last chapter, without being a direct extension of the intensity that came with the end of that chapter. All the while, the actual story and plot compounds and builds up, and things that were once background elements become the most obvious and in-your-face they've ever been, more and more as the chapter progresses, to where you as the player are realizing more and more that things are about to change forever, and there's no going back. Forcing the player to wake up to reality, that the events in Chapter 4 happened, the events happening currently in Chapter 5 are happening, and that the things that will happen in Chapter 6 will also be happening. We've been able to return to the status quo, to a state of normalcy, with fun, silly Castletown games and colourful NPC interactions. But this chapter will make us realise that this is a luxury that we won't be having for much longer, and this is the last time we will even have it. Essentially, this is the last normal chapter. And I think this kind of approach for this would be best for the game. And I think thinking about Deltarune in terms of being, well, an actual video game, rather than trying to predict things based on weird theories or trying to fit it into strange patterns that don't actually exist, like backwards Undertale theory or chess theory or whatever, is just more satisfying. People already ran into that mistake in build up to the release of Chapters 3 and 4. I don't want to focus too much on what other people are saying, however. I've been seeing people still saying things like, oh, we'll get an Icy's Pizza Dark World in Chapter 6, and we'll have Burger Pants as a companion, and there'll be a pizza box as a secret boss or some shit. And I can't help but see predictions like that as being not truly grasping that whatever this perceived quote-unquote Deltarune formula is not going to last for too much longer. And it's already been unraveling in recent chapters. And I think the knight killing Tenna should be the biggest wake-up call to this. Tenna being saved, depending on your decisions, and going back to being silly in the castle town, is simply in-universe cope on a storytelling level to lure you into a false sense of relief that maybe things aren't as bad or as serious as you thought they were. Because, oh, that dark cloud in the narrative didn't last for too long. But then Chapter 4 hits, making sure you don't forget just what this journey entails. I think Chapter 5 will be the next logical step up from Chapter 4 in this regard. In the light world, it will be a festival, a day meant for fun and entertainment. Castletown will be the most bustling it's ever been, full of quirky little recruits, and the dark world will be bright and colourful, and after the heaviness of Chapter 4, you'll more than welcome this levity. And the characters in-game will be desperate for it too, but something won't feel right. There'll be moments of seriousness and heaviness that contrasts heavily with the fun Deltarune shenanigans trying to surround it and smother it out. But the seriousness is still there, and the characters are aware of it too. These aren't simply just fun adventures and make-believe worlds anymore, and as much as they're trying to have fun with them in the festival, while they still are, it's not as much as it used to be. It feels almost a little forced. It's a feeling of nostalgia. Nostalgia for the early game, yearning for things to just go back to being a fun adventure, with no kidnappings, potential tragedies, sacrifices, missing siblings, but with a slow acceptance of the reality, before being hit with a big slap in the face. Nostalgia, facing reality, truth, hints of melancholy, a fun adventure, but things just aren't the same anymore. I think that's what Deltarune Chapter 5 will be about. Okay, maybe that got a little verbose back there, and who knows if what I said actually makes sense, but I hope it makes at least a little sense. Like, I said I'm not a YouTuber, so I have no idea how to get half these ideas across, but yeah. Oh, but would you look at that? Information from the new trailer in the surrounding newsletter is already saying something similar to what I've been thinking regarding this chapter, that there are dark clouds on the horizon. So before they encroach upon everything, let's watch the sunset. So yeah, kind of laying it on thick. Okay, but what actually happens in Chapter 5, beyond the storytelling / meta aspect? So, Asgore, a character who we can more than likely assume will be a major part of Chapter 5, what with there being a hidden prophecy panel that calls him Boss 3, in a similar vein to Tenna and Queen. Has a secret dialogue sequence where he talks about having a black shard, something we only know can be acquired from the knight, has really suspicious behaviour surrounding Carol, has really suspicious dialogue to Chris, has a conspiracy board in his basement. Oh, and if it wasn't already obvious with how ever since Chapter 1 with this room that was major Dark World bait, the recent trailer basically outright confirms that flowers are the theme of the Dark World for Chapter 5. More than likely meaning that Flower King is where it takes place. It would be genuinely shocking if Asgore wasn't deeply imported to Deltarune Chapter 5. And you know how I mentioned that Chapter 5 will have themes of nostalgia and, by extension, the past? Asgore ties into that extremely heavily. He simply cannot let go of the past, constantly trying to repair his broken marriage, obsessed with this disappearance conspiracy, and Actually, wait. The disappearance conspiracy is kinda important, isn't it? But it's weirdly not given that much focus just yet. It's very much a background thing so far. I'd honestly think the average Joe Schmo player doesn't even realize it's a thing in the game, or that it's actually one of the most important things regarding the story of this game. So, something this chapter really needs to do is actually elaborate upon that, and make it obvious to the average Joe Schmo player, basically bringing the mystery into the forefront of the game's plot, as something actually needing to be paid attention to. Because I didn't even know what a December holiday even was on my first playthrough. If this is to be important, they need to start doing things more than just sowing the seeds for it, like with the occasional references like in Chapter 2 and 3, or the very small focus on it in Chapter 4's Holiday House segment. This disappearance plotline and how it's affecting the families and just the character of December Holiday needs to finally be brought into perhaps not the spotlight, but it needs to become at least kinda relevant. And I know the perfect way of integrating it into the main story and plot of this chapter. And that's where I'm finally going to be going over my full concept outline for this theoretical Chapter 5 idea. So, Chapter 5 begins. It's the dawn of a new day, and it's the morning of the festival. This Light World segment will be more akin to the more brief chapter intros of Chapters 1 and 2, though you will be able to visit Castletown and look at all the new Chapter 4 recruits and see that Mike scene or whatever. Heck, maybe the Castletown segment has another significant Ralsei scene, though given that I think Ralsei will get some strong focus and development in Chapter 5 as a whole, maybe a big scene for him in Castletown is unnecessary. This Light World segment will have Susie telling Chris that she thinks she knows who the knight might be, and that they must investigate around town to find them. This is a very brief Light World exploratory segment, where you can walk around town, talk to NPCs, with Susie hinting that you can go towards a certain part of town. Eventually, Susie tells Chris that she has come to the conclusion that Asgore is the knight. An incorrect assumption, though given that Susie doesn't have just meta storytelling knowledge like we do, wouldn't be too terribly unreasonable of a conclusion to jump to. So, you go to Flower King, Asgore's shop, and there's already a Dark World there, making Susie believe that this is a clear confirmation he is the knight, and made this dark fountain. Susie doesn't jump in right away, and wants to give you time to prepare. This gives you the chance to go to Castletown if you have not already. And then, the Dark World segment begins. So yeah, I think it's safe to say that this Dark World is very much going to be some kind of jungle or marshland. Just very nature-esque. It is a flower store after all. But what about the secondary characters of this Dark World? What story is to be told here? Well, I think something this chapter could do is to really bring the average player up to speeds in regards to the investigation plotline happening in the background, as well as more directly explaining what the Dreamer family, and potentially even the Holiday family too, was like in the past with Azrael and what Chris used to be like before the player took control, and Toriel and Asgore's marriage, and what December used to be like, how December's disappearance affected the Holiday family in the moment. Heck, even actually really driving home that December is indeed a character. Just in general, her relationship to Azrael and Chris, what Rudy was like before his illness, and how his dynamic in the family worked. If there was a time to do things like that, it would be now, before we move into the climax of the story. And yeah, I mentioned this before, making this kind of thing obvious to the average Joe Schmo player is important. And I think I know the ideal way of doing that this chapter. But what way am I talking about that? How would this even happen? Am I suggesting the chapter just have a whole bunch of flashbacks? Well, not quite. The Dark Worlds are very clearly shaped by not only the people that make them, but also the importance and connotations assigned to them by people associated with them, and who go to them. With Chris's Dark World in Chapter 3 being probably the most obvious example of that in the game. Asgore is very clearly kind of stuck in the past a little, and really struggles to move on, etc, etc. I also mentioned this earlier, but this aspect of Asgore would very likely be something that is projected onto a Dark World made in an area that is strongly associated with him. So here's my idea that I came up with, though other people have also since come up with similar ideas. The main Darkner characters of Chapter 5's Dark World are the manifestations of Asgore's memories of the past. Specifically, the versions of the Dreamer and Holiday families that existed in the past, prior to Dessa's disappearance, before his and Toriel's separation, before Rudy's illness, etc. And I'm not suggesting the darkness be literally just memories, or they're literally just a second Chris wandering around or whatever. No. These darkness will very strongly and very obviously, unless you're really stupid, be representative of the Dreamer and Holiday families. Now, what object would these darkness be in the real world? Simple. The 7 flowers Asgore keeps preserved in jars. Very likely, the same flowers originally from his and Toriel's wedding bouquet. It works almost perfectly. Those flowers are representative of something that Asgore is trying too hard to preserve, both physically with the jars, and emotionally, with trying to win Toriel back over. They are quite literally physical manifestations of the past. So, if in the Dark World, they literally turn into a representation of the past good times, as it were, of Asgore's family and friends, would be perfect. And it would also really benefit the characterization of the cast by informing the player and Susie of what these characters were actually like back then, and perhaps even seeing actual events that happened, but without it being a literal flashback sequence. And this can be a constant reminder that reels back in the wacky adventure from getting too wacky and fun, because Susie is trying to get back to the good times, like the early game adventures, just as hard as Asgore is trying to get back to the good times of when he was still together with Toriel. Oh, and there's even the exact number of flowers needed to represent each member of the Dreamer and Holiday family, minus Asgore. It lines up so well. As for who I would line up with what flower, and using them sharing the colours of the human souls from Undertale, and lining those up with their supposed traits, as is hinted in Undertale, I would say the blue Integrity flower will represent a past Toriel. Emphasis on past Toriel, because Integrity does not exactly apply to the current Toriel, especially with Sans. And this Darkener will probably also be really important. Probably one of the most prominent Darkeners of the chapter, given that the blue flower is the only thing from this chapter that was foreshadowed upon in a previous chapter, with Miss Mizzle having dialogue talking about the quote-unquote bluest flower, and how it has elegance or whatever. I imagine this Darkener will very much sort of present a Toriel that Asgore wishes still existed, but no longer does. And it may also give insight into perhaps some of the not so great aspects of Toriel, and how she is kind of the opposite of Asgore, but perhaps too much so. Really obvious, but the green Kindness flower represents Noel. And the orange Bravery flower represents a past December. And this character will very much be what makes this chapter have the most death-related stuff in the game, up to this point, and makes her story obvious in even just her personality and what she was like before she went missing. Perhaps there can even be a point in the Dark World where the Bravery flower goes missing, and it's like this uncomfortable recreation of the real Death incident. And it's a real tone shift for the Dark World and the darkness, and even Susie is like, yeah, Chris, let's go home. This isn't a fun adventure anymore. The yellow Justice flower represents a past Carol. The blue Perseverance flower represents a past Rudy, because, you know, he's trying to persevere through his illness. The cyan Patience flower will represent a past Chris. The dialogue for Patience in Undertale is interesting though. It says, "You waited patiently, and then dethroned with a sharp attack." I don't have any crazy theory on how that line could relate to the Patience flower in Deltarune, but I just want to say that I think it could maybe hint towards something this chapter, in regards to this character. And hey, that's another thing from the most recent trailer. We see the Patience soul attack from Undertale's Photoshop flower boss fight, and it's seemingly in a solo Chris fight. What if the cyan flower waits until there is a moment where Chris is alone before it attacks? And since I lined the Patience flower up into representing a past Chris, this would in a weird way be a Chris versus Chris encounter, which could be really interesting. And not only that, it would be a way for the player to see what Chris was like before the player's control. Chris's actual personality, so to speak. Anyway, finally, the golden flower in the middle will represent a past Azrael. And even though gold doesn't have a trait associated with it, because it's not like there was a gold soul, you should know what the gold flower is referencing and why I'd associate that with Azrael. And out of all the flowers, will probably be the most important one. Given that the Asgore prophecy panel depicts him with a crown, perhaps the Azrael flower is a prince. And, you know, Rousey and Azrael are very clearly meant to resemble one another, and both are princes. And there was that weird tweet with Rousey getting mixed up with flowers. Oh wait, that hasn't happened yet, from Toby Fox years ago. I don't think it's too bold of a prediction to say that maybe Rousey gets confused for being this Azrael Golden Prince flower, maybe gets separated from the rest of the group, and this is where a lot of the significant Rousey introspection and character focus could come from, when he sees yet another Darkner, an object that is just like him, acts similar to him, and has his very own face, all referencing someone else. And I imagine these Darkners wouldn't just be flowers in the Dark World. I think ideally they should uncannily resemble the Dreamer and Holiday families, without looking one-to-one like them. Given that they share colours with the 6 human souls from Undertale, perhaps as Darkners they vaguely resemble humans? Perhaps with plant stem-like limbs and sharing the silhouettes of the young Dreamer Holiday families while not literally being boss monsters or deers? And given that we've seen a one-to-one attack from Undertale associated with the souls, I would assume they would each have a weapon resembling the items dropped by the other 6 humans from Undertale, such as the yellow Dark having a revolver, the green Darkner having a frying pan, etc. Though how this would be incorporated in a way that makes sense for Deltarune beyond Undertale fan service, I'm not quite sure of. And I think all these flowers, at least in the concept sort of how I'm thinking of, would each get their own themes, and they would each reference the different sections of Your Best Nightmare from Undertale that correspond to the Soul Section remixes of Your Best Friend, while instead of Your Best Friend being the motif, instead it's some new melody that evokes Your Best Friend, also combined with a melody that is similar to the melody of the characters the flower represents, without being the exact same. Like, say, the Noelle's flower theme is a lower BPM version of the Kindness Soul's Your Best Nightmare segment, with the motif not literally being Girl Next Door, but sounds really dang similar to Girl Next Door, with perhaps some flourishes of Your Best Friend, since these are flowers after all. If there was a time to use that motif in Deltarune, it would be in Chapter 5. And yes, I am aware that I'm saying that when Chris, Rudy, and Carol don't even really have themes yet, but I do think these characters will get themes in the future, especially Carol. So for their flower counterparts, their themes are sort of like foreshadowing for their eventual actual theme they'll get later. Though for Chris, that later might be a lot later, like one of the last songs in the game in the entire OST later. So yeah, I really like this concept for the Darkness for this chapter. And look, okay, I get it. It might be a bit out there. And this idea, I guess, isn't all that unique, since in looking for images to use for this video, I just randomly stumbled upon a Reddit post that had the exact same Dreamer plus Holiday Family Flower King idea. So yeah, I guess this idea may not be that out there. Now, what about Asgore? What will he be doing in the Dark World? He's titled as Boss 3 and has a crown, so he must be some kind of king and the primary antagonist of the chapter. Well, I have a really unorthodox idea for this prophecy panel and just Asgore's actions in this chapter. If we're to go for the safest concept, Asgore will be a king in the Dark World just like Toriel was a queen in the Dark World. Maybe he's really pathetic and tries to prove to everyone what he saw regarding Des, tries to win back Toriel, sees her with Sans and, I don't know, has a meltdown in the Dark World and wants to just live with fake flower Toriel instead and has to be knocked back into reality through a fight and be humbled and get a dose of reality that Toriel doesn't care about him, and yeah, okay. I don't love this idea, and I fear that this is what's likely going to happen in this chapter. However, this video is more so my concept / pitch for Chapter 5, not what I think is most statistically likely, so I have a different idea. Okay, so I think that when you first get into the Dark World, Asgore is very weird and mysterious. Maybe you only see him from behind, walking away, or talking just out of view, ordering subordinates around, but taking very good care of the flower Darkners, perhaps literally preserving them and giving them life, so they don't wilt. And the Dark World I actually think will be the shortest Dark World in ages. I'd say maybe even only about the size of Chapter 1's Dark World content, from entering the closet and that whole Cliffs and Castletown segment all the way to the end of the Card Kingdom. And this will feel kind of shocking, but after seeing how Chris is getting uncomfortable past memories bubbling to the surface with all this sad level of nostalgia being personified in the Dark World, Rousey having even more of an identity crisis with his status as a Darkner, and Susie just not getting the fun adventure she wants because there's constant reminders of this quest becoming more serious and less jovial. If I'm to slot stuff from the trailer into my concept, I would put that white pen of hope shot maybe towards the end, because obviously this isn't actually the white pen of hope. The talk of a pen is just a metaphor. There isn't actually this MacGuffin weapon that will solve every problem. But perhaps Susie yearns for things to be just as simple as that. And so that hope manifests itself in the Dark World. But of course, the pen doesn't do anything. They can't just be so naive. And I think the TV in Asgore's shop could turn into a character that could even further demonstrate this theme of things not being as fun anymore. It's a broken down TV. It wouldn't work anymore. Given Chris and Susie's newly formed connections between TV and Tenor, perhaps in the Dark World, this TV turns into a Darkner that is very much like Tenor, or maybe trying to be Tenor is a more accurate term. Perhaps the Darkner wants to do similar wacky minigame stuff like Tenor likes to do, but keeps breaking down, turning off, turning to static. Say this character feels a similar sort of presence in the Dark World to like a Rules did in Chapter 1. Shows up towards the end in the final dungeon of the Dark World for a bit of levity from the heaviness with silly puzzles. But unlike Rules, this Tenor-like character eventually just stops, breaks down. Their act gets cut short, as it were. There's been lots of speculation of Chapter 5 having a Tenor-like character due to there being a TV in Asgore's shop, but I don't think it should be too major of a character. So I think a smaller Rules in Chapter 1, like a role, would fit a character like that. So, if the Flower Darkness are the Lancers of the Dark World, and the broken down Tenor is the Rules, then the Asgore we've been chasing this whole chapter finally make an actual appearance only at the end, similar to King from Chapter 1. And hey, considering that the trailer showed some Rudin-like enemies, maybe this chapter will actually have some Chapter 1 connections. And at the end, the characters will finally get to talk to Asgore, and things don't seem fully right. There's something off about his behaviour. His dialogue is off, maybe kind of erratic, and his facial expressions are slightly off. Like he almost seems a bit deranged or neurotic. Whether Susie at this point still believes he's the knight doesn't matter, because then Asgore initiates a fight against the party, justifying it by him wanting to protect the flowers and all the metaphors that you can associate with that. So, the party fights Asgore. Susie eventually comes to the conclusion that he's probably not the knight, and that this whole investigation into Flower King was a dud, and that maybe trying to squeeze in one last adventure is a lost cause, and that maybe they should just enjoy their time with the festival instead, and have their fun that way, even if Ralsei won't be involved that way. And that's the end of the Flower King Dark World. But when they seal the fountain, Asgore is nowhere to be seen. But they don't have too much time to linger on this, because the festival is just about to start. You obviously have a little bit of time to go back to Castletown, drop off the Chapter 5 recruits and all that good stuff. But even though it seems like the chapter has been rather short so far, and that it might end soon, the festival will almost undoubtedly be the longest Lightworld section of the whole game. Even longer than the church sequence plus Holiday House sequence from Chapter 4. There'll be a whole load of long sections with Noelle and Birdley and some of the other classmates. Rudy might try and force himself to walk around for the festival too, much to the concern of everyone. And hey, maybe even Papyrus will be there. We can only hope. And I don't even think it'll all just be cutscenes and dialogue or whatever. I think the festival will have a bunch of minigames too, maybe resulting in things you can bring to Castletown. And perhaps those carnival prizes or rewards become something else in the Dark World? I don't know, just a spontaneous idea I just thought of. Oh, and I also totally think in the festival, we see another segment where the soul gets separated from Chris, with Chris presumably planning with Carol, but without letting the player in on what they are planning. Now, the festival's theme. What do I mean by that? Well, I think it's really easy to just think that the festival will be like a regular Western festival, with markets and Ferris wheels and all that, which I do think it will have, but oftentimes when I think of festivals in regards to stories, I'll actually think of festivals in Japan, with yukatas, catching fish, shaved ice, takoyaki stands, and basically what I'm saying is, Toby is like painfully immersed himself in Japan. I genuinely think that the festival might actually lean more towards Japanese influence, rather than Western ones. And yes, here's when I bring up another trailer thing. We see Japanese influence within the trailer, with sakura trees, so yeah, definite Japan influence. But not only do I think the festival will be more Japanese themed, but I also think it will be themed around the prophecy. AKA, the festival isn't just entertainment, it's actually cultural. Well, kind of. It's not going to be super duper religious or whatever. Like, I'm not saying the festival is one giant church service. But I don't think the festival is purely just for entertainment and leisure. I think there's some kind of cultural / religious tradition to do with it. And I think that's going to be just a tad important for the story. Potentially with whatever Carol may be scheming in, may even be relevant to why the police sacrifice starts the next week of the festival. Maybe it has something to do with the prophecy, and the festival ties into that heavily. Yeah, I'm being vague because I myself don't understand what greater significance the festival has, or what it could lead to. But either way, I think there's more to the festival. And perhaps by the end of the festival sequence, there will be something significant that is relevant to the prophecy that occurs or is revealed. Something like that. But also, as the festival slowly starts to wrap up and the sun begins to set, you start to think back on the chapter and go, that Dark World was weirdly kind of short, wasn't it? And Asgore's been acting kind of strange. He's acting like nothing has happened in that Dark World. He just doesn't mention it at all. And seriously, what is going on with the Knight right now? We have not seen them at all this entire chapter. And just, who are they? But just when you start to ask all these questions, all of a sudden, just as the festival is ending, perhaps with some choir or ceremony relating to the prophecy, completely out of nowhere, Carol pulls out a katana and stabs the ground, and the festival is covered in darkness. And thus the end of Chapter 5. This is the first half, and the start of the second half of Chapter 5. A second Dark World. So, I think the thing I find really perplexing with Deltarune as a narrative going forward into these last 3 chapters is that it almost feels like 3 chapters left is 1 chapter too little. Chapter 7 will be the climax and resolution. Chapter 6 will be the intense build-up to that, potentially even having a little bit of the start of the climax within it. And Chapter 5 will mark the final bit of normalcy, before we enter the endgame, as it were. And in terms of actual plot / character stuff that needs to happen, you can easily fit it into these chapters, or at least we'd assume. Chapter 7 will have angel stuff, however meta they will go with that is up in the air though. Chapter 6 will be in lead up to that, and will probably have the Roaring, the Shelter, and might even have another major Knight encounter, probably the final one. But Chapter 5, under all circumstances, the thing that would fit the most here would be Carol, and her alliance with Chris and the Knight. So it should be simple. Chapter 5 through 7, in terms of central conflicts, should be Carol, then Titan / Knight, and then whatever the hell will be going with the Angel. So, it almost feels like the Asgore stuff that this chapter has been hinting towards seems out of place in terms of the grander narrative. It feels like too much of a detour / side story. But there's too much building up Asgore for that to simply be ignored either. But you really can't ignore Carol either. She's built up to be too significant. But Chapter 6 feels too late for that kind of thing. If you saved the entire climax for Chapter 7, or had Carol's story bleed into the climax at the same time, it would probably feel narratively rushed. But what if we get both in one chapter? Both Asgore and Carol's stories, perhaps even being used to parallel one another. And Chapter 4 made the idea of one Dark World per chapter get thrown immediately out the window. There's no rules for structuring these things anymore. So yeah, we went through a full Dark World that, while being the length of Chapter 1, felt a little short compared to what we're used to with recent chapters. And that's by design, because there's a second decently sized Dark World in Chapter 5. If the Flower King Dark World is like the Chapter 3 of this Chapter 5 release of Deltarune, the Festival Dark World is like the Chapter 4 of this release, where things really pick up in the real star of the show, with Carol as a primary antagonist, and who will initially be presented as being the Knight. Or maybe she actually is the real Roaring Knight, I don't know. So this second Dark World, the Festival Dark World, I think the flower theming will still be quite strong, since Asgore's flowers will presumably be decorated around hometown during the festival. And I still think Asgore will have at least somewhat of a presence within this Dark World too, even if he isn't the main force and focus like in the first Dark World. So visual identity associated with Asgore being presented in this Dark World is still fine. But obviously, there will be strong Japanese theming for this Dark World, And that really fits because of Carol's association with some Japanese thing, like katanas and shurikens. And goddamn do I not love how the trailer showed Japanese stuff and is leading people into thinking this same thing, because now it just sounds like I'm getting these ideas from the trailer, but whatever. And yeah, I totally think it's a possibility that there'll be some kind of not so subtle Toho reference in this Dark World, given the blatant Japanese theming in a game with bullet hell mechanics. Heck, I heard somewhere that Toby Fox talked about an old fan-made character he created based on the Toho franchise, so maybe even that character can show up as an Easter egg, or maybe a secret boss or something? I don't know, could be nifty. Now, onto the characters of this Dark World, and it'll be a lot bigger of a cast compared to the first one, though don't worry, it's not going to be like the entire town is all brought into the Dark World and every classmate and NPC is in the Dark World doing stuff. That'd be too much. Really, I just think that for this Dark World, to contrast the first one, having representations of the Dreamer and Holiday families, this Dark World will have the real modern Dreamer and Holiday families be the main characters, minus Azrael and December, of course. Noelle in this chapter will be interesting. It feels like she should join up with the party again, but I really feel like even if Noelle is brought into a Dark World again for this chapter, that she'll be off to the side. So yeah, I'm predicting she won't join the party again for this chapter, and instead, because the entire Holiday family gets brought in, maybe perhaps instead she goes mainly with her father Rudy. And I think Rudy will play a pretty decently big role this chapter. He won't be super important, far less than Carol, but I think he'll be of surprising prominence in this Dark World. And this Dark World might even give him his own theme and corresponding leitmotif, due to now being in a non-mundane scenario. And yes, I might as well say this now, but this Dark World, Carol will also get her own theme. Probably just called Carol, as opposed to the C one we got before. Basically, if Carol is a parallel to Asgore, then C is the small shock equivalent for her, and not her actual theme. And these themes will be, I guess you could say, foreshadowed earlier in the chapter with their Flower Darkner counterparts. And I think Rudy being in the Dark World will make him healthy again. Or at least seemingly. It'll give him a lot more energy than before. Give him magic he couldn't use before. It'll be to him just like the Dragon Blazers game he loved playing with his daughter. And I think he'll take this being brought to another realm maybe a bit too well. Oh, and you know, Lancer and Rules have been in 3 separate chapters already. I think it would be neat if Chapter 5 had returning darkness from previous chapters too, but had it be a different one. And wouldn't you know it, this has already seemingly been foreshadowed already, because Jackenstein mentioned that he'd be at the festival. So yeah, he could totally show up in Chapter 5's festival, and Festival Dark World by extension, and fill a similar sort of role that Lancer does in Chapters 2 and 3. Just brief appearances here and there. Toriel will also be in the Dark World, of course, and I think we might find out why Tenna was so focused on not having her wake up in the Dark World. She might have some interesting reaction. And of course, Carol will be the primary antagonist of this Dark World. Now, what she'll actually be doing, I don't know, because I don't know the grander story involved in her plan with Chris or whatever. I don't think she'll be super evil or whatever, but she'll definitely be a serious threat and antagonistic figure. More of a villain than Asgore was in Undertale, let's just say that. And speaking of Asgore, he just becomes more and more confusing, even now in this Dark World. He won't act quite like he did in the previous Dark World. In fact, his design isn't even the same. He was a king in the last Dark World, and now in this Dark World, he'll have some vague kind of vintage superhero look. Just, what is going on? And come to think of it, why would he even fight his own child? It's not like Birdley, where he thinks the Dark Worlds are a dream or whatever. He already in Chapter 4 seems to be kind of aware of them, at least a little. So why would Asgore fight Chris? Well, what if it wasn't Asgore? Yes, in my concepts / predictions / whatever you want to call this thing, the Asgore you saw throughout the entirety of the Flower King Dark World is not actually Asgore. It's a Darkner. One that looks like Asgore. Yeah, this idea might just be a little out there and might be too crazy compared to what would realistically happen, but come on. We need some more outrageous ideas and reveals, or else this wouldn't be Deltarune. Well, if it's a Darkner, what object would it be? One that's related to the 7 flowers? A secret 8th flower? Maybe one representing the Red Soul? No, the flowers representing the family members is already a fanfiction-like idea. There being a secret 8th flower would be silly. No, the Darkener Asgore is the glass jars personified, like a cage, constantly trying to preserve them as how they were for eternity, appearing as resembling Asgore because it was Asgore also doing that, to both the flowers and just the past in general. Yeah, okay, this concept might not even make sense and is mostly vibe-based, but it's something. But what about the other Darkness from Chapter 5's first Dark World? Specifically, will the 7 flowers appear in this one too? Well, I already said that for this Dark World, instead of it being Darkener representations of the Holiday and Dreamer families, it would be the actual ones. So those Darkener representations also being there would be a bit much, but don't think the flowers should be thrown away just yet. I think Chapter 5's second Dark World could be a great way to re-emphasize and reiterate what we got with Chapter 4's second Dark World. You know, the lighting of the mind has changed. That because this Dark World was created by a different person, or if circumstances are different, or even changes with the objects occur, that certain things within the Dark World are fundamentally different. Specifically, I think during the Light World segment, Asgore will take the flowers out of the glass jars and into a bouquet to give tutorial. These really special flowers that hold significant meaning, being brought out of this carefully monitored preservation to give to his ex-wife. Whether he ends up actually doing that, I'm not sure of, but basically, this results in the flowers being brought into a different state, one that is not caged by the glass jars, and instead are brought together into a bouquet. And that will change the Dark World form of these flowers into that of a single being. This will serve to both incorporate these darkness from the Flower King Dark World into this new one as some kind of cohesion for the whole chapter, but bringing down the number of characters within this Dark World from being ridiculous like it would be if they were to continue the presence they had in the exact same form as the Flower King Dark World. Granted, the form this Darkener will take will effectively make them a different character, perhaps more monstrous, really represent the brokenness of these families in Asgore's marriage. Maybe even a little pathetic, considering that this Dark World is made by Carol, and will be primarily based around her connotations for objects and concepts and, you know, that sort of thing. Her view on Asgore is probably not favourable, though she certainly is working some kind of deal with Asgore, and even if not fully, is involving him a little in hers. And I think the form of this Darkener should reflect all of these things. These flowers, this representation of Asgore's desperation, will be weaponized in its personified Dark World form by Carol. Specifically some kind of emotional hired muscle, as it were. Like some kind of massive angry flower, dragon, or hydra that does everything Carol asks it to do. But what about Asgore's role within the Dark World? The real Asgore? I'm not fully sure of that. But I think within this Dark World, he'll be very questionable of Carol's actions due to being someone who thought he knew what her plan entailed. And it wasn't this. But he might take this a little less seriously than some of the others because he thinks he still trusts Carol, which she very clearly can't be trusted right now. So yeah, some superhero Asgore will be. And yeah, Asgore will be a hero instead of a king, because of not only his affinity for superhero comic books as shown within Deltarune itself here and there, as well as within some other post-Undertale Asgore stuff. Asgore is clearly getting some characterization involving heroes and things like that, so his Dark World form, being a superhero, just feels fitting. But where I think Asgore will shine within this Dark World is with Rousey. I mentioned that I think that the Flower King Dark World will be furthering this sort of identity crisis for Rousey, and questioning his place and his role and his very existence. But I think the real Asgore, after he sees Rousey, could be something really interesting. I don't know how exactly this would go about, but I think Asgore having a heart-to-heart with Rousey and encouraging him in a similar but different way to what happened with Susie in Chapter 4 could be really interesting and very important for Rousey's character. So I don't think this will fully be revealed in Chapter 5, but I'll say this theory anyway just in case, but I personally don't think Rousey is any kind of object, like the green crayon or red horn headband or whatever. And Rousey being connected in some way to Asriel is, I think, important, but maybe not in the way people expect. And the wording deepest dark relating to Rousey is curious, so Here's what I think Rousei is, because I might not otherwise have a chance to talk about it. Rousei isn't anything at all. The deepest dark refers to how much darkness makes up Rousei. In the real world, darkness isn't actually an actual thing, it's the absence of light. Most darkness are created from objects that inspired their creation. Deepest dark refers to Rousei not even having an object in which he is inspired from. He's not tied to anything in the light world, and that's why he can show up anywhere. Rousei is intangible, literally just a thought. And I'm not going to elaborate on this too much since it's not fully related to Chapter 5, but I think that's what those glitchy dark cat faces you can spot in certain parts of the game that people have been calling friends are too, and are one and the same with what Rousei is. Things from the deepest dark that don't even represent anything. They're the darkness itself. Oh, and even more unrelated, I want to mention this crazy theory that I've thought about for a while, that I've even had in a more primitive form as far back as Chapter 2. But I would put Charm into this shared category with Rousei, and the friends as well. And Charm was made even more suspicious in Chapters 3 and 4, with him being drawn on Asriel's computer. So, crackpot theory, but Charm was originally just a random friend cat, with no purpose and just being a concept. Then, Asriel in December, and maybe Chris in the past, went to a dark world before the events of the game. And them not understanding what it was, became attached to this darkness Schrodinger's cat, this literal conceptual entity, and then made Charm a reverse darkener, as it were, by creating a handmade stuffed doll with buttons for eyes in the real world that this conceptual idea can be bound to, and that became Charm, and was a companion in some previous Dark World adventure of some kind, in a similar role to Rousei. Yes, crazy theory, and it's probably fake and super fanfiction-y, but hey, sometimes we just have some crazy ideas. But that doesn't mean Rousei's literally based off nothing. It's just something less particular, more of a feeling or mindset. Okay, so yeah, safe to say I don't think Rousei is the red horn headband. But if he's not the headband, then why does Rousei have red horns? It's a weird detail to have otherwise. Well, I think it's intentional, and it does reference the red horn headband, but not because Rousei literally is the red horn headband come to life. So, to cut to the chase, I think Rousei is maybe some kind of subconscious personification of Chris. Whether it's what Chris wants to be, with being like the Dreamer family with red horns, or being a nicer kid, or this is how maybe Asriel saw Chris, I don't know. Either way, I think Rousei is telling a lot more about Chris than what one may initially think at first glance. And I think Rousei is kind of a more direct parallel to Chris, and because of this, finally looping back around to Chapter 5, Rousei's development in Chapter 5 in not being hopeless about his role within the story of the prophecy, and Rousei's entire existence and learning that he matters, will mirror a future development involving Chris. And instead of the role within the story of the prophecy, it's the story of the game, and Chris's whole existence outside of the player, and learning that Chris matters. But for specifically Rousei, it's not a very unique idea, but yeah, I think Asgore will give him some kind of heart-to-heart, and perhaps even a solo fight to teach him a powerful attack spell in the form of fire magic, and to perhaps not let people walk all over him, and to think about his own wants and that whole thing. Essentially, the Inferno of Jealousy, mentioned in the Hammer of Justice fight, is not referring to Asgore getting mad at Sans or some shit. It's Rousei allowing himself to be jealous and think about his own individuality, with the Inferno itself being a torrential wave of fire magic. And hey, in a Dark World with Carol, who's more than likely going to be some kind of Ice Queen in a Dark World form, having fire is probably very useful. So, Rousei will be far from useless here. So basically, I said probably way too much to just lead up to the same sort of thing that everyone else has been saying, is probably where the character of Rousei is going. But hey, I'm just saying there's more that makes that concept of a solo Rousei fight / heart-to-heart against Asgore so much better than even what most of the people hoping that it happens even realize. And hey, might as well throw out the idea that maybe this mandatory solo Rousei fight against Asgore is also the Shadow Crystal boss for Chapter 5. And instead of being a different soul color, instead it will use the different attack colors from Undertale, since Asgore was one of the few bosses that used blue attacks, and like one of the only enemies in the entire game to use orange attacks. And will be a mandatory Shadow Crystal to introduce the idea of Shadow Crystals to new players. I'm not fully subscribed to that idea myself, but hey, it's totally a possibility, and I could somewhat see it happening. And I don't really have any other solid ideas for Shadow Crystal bosses for this chapter anyway. So yeah, this second Dark World that Carol creates, I didn't go through it chronologically, and honestly, I wouldn't even know the best way to structure something like that with the real Dreamer and Holiday families all going to this Dark World and having this other important plot on the side involving Rousey. Maybe to ramp up the seriousness, there are some of those Titan spawn encounters within this Dark World as well. Or if you wanted to have a mandatory Shadow Crystal to introduce the concept of them to players that missed all the prior ones, but not have it be Asgore that has it, and not have it be some other random Darkner, to make use of the carnival theming, perhaps they could do something to where if you didn't defeat Jevil in the Card Kingdom, the Joker card is plucked from the old classroom and specifically brought into the Festival Dark World to be a formidable opponent. Just have it be the same fight as in Chapter 1, but maybe the attacks hit a little harder since you will also have more health. And hey, Toby Fox mentioned that he, in hindsight, wishes he did more regarding the lead up to fighting Jevil. So perhaps that could be brought over into Chapter 5? And yeah, Jevil is kinda a hard fight, but we're getting to a point in Deltarune where the difficulty of the main bosses are on the same level as some of the older secret bosses. Like, the Titan fight was genuinely more difficult than normal route spam to Neo, in my opinion. So making the first secret boss become a mandatory mid-boss could be cool. And hey, new players that had no idea Jevil existed the entire time, being given a Shadow Crystal from his defeat, then being told that there's nothing you can do with only one Shadow Crystal and to look back to previous chapters to find the rest and bring them back, I could see Deltarune doing something interesting like that. But either way, the Festival Dark World would end with a fight against Carol, perhaps after passing through some kind of fortress made out of ice, as some kind of sprawling dungeon you have to navigate. And also again, the gang is led to believe Carol is the Roaring Knight, since they saw her create a Dark Fountain and talks about stuff similar-ish to what the Knight has been doing. So this is portrayed as a very big part of the story. So yeah, a fight against Carol Holiday commences. Perhaps joined by Noelle, maybe Rudy too? And yeah, I'm not fully sure how this fight would go about, but you know, if Carol's battle theme involves a bit of heartache as some kind of motif of mothers in these two families being brought to do things they don't want to do, but must do, I think that would be pretty nifty. So yeah, this Dark World ends, Carol is defeated somehow, I don't know. I haven't thought this part of the idea through all that much. But I think when the Dark World segment ends, we get some huge holiday family stuff. Maybe Carol fully talks about what her plan was, fully airs out the whole thing with the disappearance of December, or at least what she thinks happened. Basically a scene that doubles as a huge lore drop, as well as just the characters talking with each other. And I think during this scene, and something I just really foresee happening in Chapter 5 in general, regardless of this particular concept, Rudy Holiday, putting on a big smile during the Dark World, having as much of a fun adventure with his daughter that he can, even if it is a dire situation, now no longer in the Dark World, back in his weak, frail body, after having pushed himself both in the festival and in the Dark World, can simply no longer keep going, and passes away right in front of everyone's eyes. Rudy isn't just sick for no reason. Something is going to happen in the story regarding his illness, especially him pushing himself keep walking around at church and then getting even more sick afterwards. It really feels like it's building towards something major, like a Rudy death scene. If things weren't already real before, then Rudy's death will be a cold hard dose of reality slapping everyone in the face. Maybe the festival is going on still, but wrapping up with a fireworks show, while everyone can't even be bothered to look at them because they're too distraught. Eventually, Chris and Susie get asked to leave, and to give the Holiday family some space and time alone. Chris wanders home, but just before Chris goes to bed, there's a knock on the door. Now, of all times, right after a close friend of the family dies, Azrael comes home. It's bittersweet. He wasn't even there to make it to the festival in time. There's a short scene with Chris and Azrael just sitting there, not talking much, but just being in each other's presence again for the first time in a long time. even if this isn't the ideal circumstance for Azrael's return, the two of them can at least appreciate this small moment. Eventually, Azrael decides that the festival is not truly over until the day is finished. It's not midnight just yet, and even though no one is around much at all, and there's no working minigames or Ferris wheels or fireworks, Chris and Azrael just quietly walk around the festival, bonding as much as they can on this terrible night. Eventually, Azrael decides to also meet up with his dad, because he hasn't seen him yet, and goes to Flower King. But what they find there is not what he expects. Asgore is not the only one there. Carol is there too. Asgore is barely holding it together, but there's no other time like the present to do what he must do. Carol follows behind Asgore into the basement of the flower shop, into a room filled with corkboards and papers strewn about the whole place. Asgore is desperate to finally show everyone the truth in what he's found, and it starts with Carol. He pulls out a black shard. He mentions that he has met the knight itself, fought it, and acquired a chipped piece of black metal from its sword. Before Carol can say anything, Asgore creates a dark fountain in his basement. Him, Carol, and Chris and Azrael, who are sneaking behind, get brought to a third Dark World. This Dark World is brief. It's not another big adventure, it's an investigation. Asgore's overwhelming nostalgia for the past has actually come in handy, because using old newspapers and his own strong nostalgia for the past, Asgore creates a Dark World that is a literal recreation of the hometown of the past. Perhaps it's a direct reference to New Home from Undertale, where it's a monochrome copy of a previous town. Call it New Hometown, I guess. Asgore spots Chris and Azrael, and he figures that with a bigger audience, he can get across his discoveries even better, especially Azrael, who was close to December holiday. Speaking of Azrael, him in the Dark World is strange. He seems weirdly not as shocked to be in an alternate dimension as he should be. And he almost seems weirdly familiar with some of the mechanics of things, effortlessly using magic. Ralsei shows up not too much later, and with his newfound confidence, doesn't get bothered by looking too much like Azrael, and actually takes it well. Azrael is a little weirded out that someone looks so much like him, even more so when Ralsei isn't the only one like that. Yeah, the recreations of the Holiday and Dreamer families return, maybe looking slightly distorted due to the flowers actually being exposed to the air, and maybe have even been damaged in the commotion from Carol earlier. And the fake glass Asgore is there too. Perhaps now more visibly different from Asgore, maybe being translucent. But they aren't too active of characters. They're simply recreating the same things the real versions did all those years ago, going about their daily lives. And with them, and the entirety of Hometown in the past being recreated, the truth of everything is revealed. The truth of December Holiday's disappearance. What that is, I don't know. But this far into the game, and at the end of Chapter 5, I think now would be the best time to learn about it. And right afterwards, the Roaring Knight finally appears in Chapter 5. Carol, finally seeing the Knight face to face, is shocked, frozen. She knows just who that is, but the Knight doesn't care. It summons its knife, and charges at Carol. Just before the Knight can kill Carol, Susie appears, blocking the attack, having been also following behind everyone, wondering what was going on. Carol is still a little bit hurt, Susie not fully blocking the entire attack, but it's okay, because Susie uses her healing magic to help Carol, strongly contrasting how the two might have acted earlier in the chapter, especially if Susie did end up going to the festival with Noelle. That would surely not make Carol happy, but Susie puts that aside to save Carol. Then the Knight screams out. A rematch against the Roaring Knight begins. It's the same fight as before in Chapter 3, but the party has help, and they're not hopeless anymore. Chris, Susie with a great healing spell, a stronger Ralsei, Azrael, Carol, and of course Asgore, all at once are fighting against the Roaring Knight. The fight is still somewhat difficult, but it's cushioned a bit by having every turn having 3 extra people unleashing their own attacks against the Knight, and at times going in to block attacks and make the damage you take be a lot less. And just the party in general being stronger since it's now 2 chapters later. Essentially, the Knight fight in Chapter 3 is like the hard mode of this fight. This fight is a lot easier. The Knight is extremely outnumbered, and before you know it, you reach a new phase of the fight, where the Knight gets a little desperate, using more erratic, out there attacks. But before it can do anything crazy, the fight goes to a halt, and Asgore steps in. The Knight is weak right now. Now is their best chance. Asgore puts up an extremely formidable fight, even just on his own against the Knight.
Not only is he already a strong monster, the strongest in Hometown, but him being in a dark world has made him even more powerful. And not only that, but Asgore has a black shard, essentially giving him a weapon on par with the Knights. The Knight tries everything it can to defeat Asgore, or to get away, but Asgore simply won't let it do that. Even if Asgore has lost everything, even if his family is crumbling apart, he must protect what's left of it at any cost. And, with Rousey now knowing some strong fire magic, and Susie still having learned great healing magic, it seems the Knight is greatly outmatched. Until the Knight does something drastic. The Knight stabs Asgore in his soul. Circling back a bit, if the Asgore in the first Dark World was fake, and Asgore didn't make that Dark World, then who did? Well, look at the trailer. Look at the colouring of the sprites. It's not different like the second Sanctuary was. Yeah. The Roaring Knight made the Flower King Dark World. Or maybe Chris, but I don't know. Specifically, it made a Dark Fountain in Flower King to bring Asgore to a Dark World. It needs Asgore, just like it needs Undyne. But the party was able to seal the fountain before Asgore was able to make it there. But now that Asgore is here, now's the perfect chance for the Knight to do what it wants. Make Asgore a sacrifice, just like Undyne. But Asgore's putting up too much of a fight. There's simply no way that the Knight can do the same thing it did with Undyne and kidnap him to the shelter. So, the Knight simply just has to skip a step and sacrifice Asgore right here and now. So, while Asgore is holding down the Knight, trying to keep it from escaping or hurting anyone else, the Knight stabs Asgore with his own black shard. But it's not trying to kill him. No. The Knight stabs Asgore in the same way one stabs the ground to create a dark fountain, literally infusing an endless source of darkness within Asgore's soul. Darkness is spewing out of him, his fire magic turning black and colour draining out his body. Before he can even get a chance to say anything, Asgore turns fully dark and lifeless, but still animate, still moving. Asgore has turned into a second Knight, and is the real final boss of Chapter 5. As a way of more greatly hinting into how the Roaring Knight came to be, and bringing to question who the Knight originally was before its soul got consumed by darkness, and bringing to question who was the one to do the stabbing. Yeah, Chris totally stabbed December. Assuming December is the Knight, because honestly December is the only candidate that works with this Chapter 5 pitch I created. Unless the Knight is Chris, and the Chris we play as is the vessel that replaced Chris, but that idea is so crazy, but weirdly makes more sense to me than some of the other options. Okay. Anyway, no more tangents. Essentially, this is also a way of having the chapter boss be actually Asgore, without just having it be a regular Asgore deciding to fight his own child because he's that angry about his unrequited love for Toriel or whatever. Because, I don't know, Asgore being presented as that much of a loser would just be sad. So yes, I did low-key just suggest that Chapter 5 isn't just going to have an Asgore fight, but have 3 of them. If the process of watching this video didn't make you completely lose faith in my ideas and predictions already, then this surely will. This fight is not going to be as hard as the Knight in Chapter 3. This is still a main mandatory boss after all, so Azrael and Carol will still be joining you to do extra attacks and take on some damage, and help in any way they can. And the Roaring Knight will have ran away, so you're only dealing with just this Knight to fight Asgore. Even still, this fight will be quite challenging. More difficult than Chapter 4's Titan fight, that's for sure. Oh, and Asgore isn't making it out of this. To grossly oversimplify how I sort of feel Deltarune is heading, I'm just going to say, I don't think the ending of Deltarune will leave many people happy with the outcome of things. I think characters are going to die and stay dead, or be left sad, and no one's going to be coming back to life. It's going to make the fact that Deltarune only has one ending be a tough pill to swallow. And Asgore staying dead is going to be one of many reasons for it. I'm not saying the party literally kills Asgore. Asgore is already dead when he got stabbed in the soul. He's just sort of zombified, but then gets stopped. But probably maybe later in the fight, Asgore maybe tries to claw his way out of being totally consumed by the darkness. Like, there's a little bit of him still in there. Like, maybe he goes in for the kill on Chris, but then he holds his other arm back. Like, he's not fully in control of his own actions. I don't know, something like that. But yeah, he is eventually stopped, and now for the end of the chapter. One of the original plans for the release of Deltarune was to have chapters 3, 4, and 5 all be one single release. And I believe Toby Fox initially wanted this idea because it was to do with the ending of chapter 5 being something extremely important to Deltarune as a whole. And I think I know what it is. I don't think it's a Roaring Knight identity reveal, or a Shelter cliffhanger. I think it's the reveal of Deltarune's main villain. I don't know fully how Toby Fox would do this, but here's the idea I'm suggesting. So, the chapter ends with the final Dark World being sealed. Everyone's in the Light World. The Night is nowhere to be seen. Everything has settled down, but no one can relax. The Dreamer and Holiday families both lost their fathers the same night. Carol ruined the festival, and the looming dread that the Night is planning to do something drastic, and it could happen as soon as tomorrow. Everyone is about to go home, too exhausted from this whole mess that they just need to rest. But then, Chris rips out their soul once again, this time right in front of everyone's eyes. And then Chris creates a dark fountain, and then another one, and then another one, and then Chris starts making so many dark fountains, the very earth beneath them begins to shake. Dark smog is erupting out of the ground. Carol seems visibly shocked. Not even this was part of her plan. Just what is Chris doing? Chris has made so many dark fountains that the very darkness is beginning to form something. Titans. Multiple of them, in fact. The roaring has begun, and Chris is responsible for it. Thus ends Chapter 5. Roll credits. So yeah, that's my theoretical concept for Chapter 5. That'll probably be horrifically debunked in a few days. Okay, yeah, I guess all of this happening in one chapter is a little absurd and might be too much. Like, this would be quite a bit longer than Chapter 4 and probably have too much going on, but hey, maybe it was a fun listen and who knows, maybe I got like at least some things right, or half right? Probably not the Knightified Asgore or Azrael showing up though, or the fake Glass Asgore, Flower Hydra, or Jevil rematch. Okay, there's a lot I said that was too out there, but hey, maybe if I say enough crazy things, one of them will actually turn out to be true. Oh yeah, one final thing. What is the weird route going to be like in this chapter? Is the weird route going to end this chapter? Well, that I don't think so. I don't think the weird route is going to be all that crazy this chapter. It'll probably be more than we got for Chapter 4, but not as big as Chapter 2. I think the main diverging aspect of the weird route this chapter will be the festival, and I think that part will be completely different, which is a decently big change. But all the Dark World stuff I can see being mostly the same up until the end, where I think we'll get something that diverges drastically, which will then leave us off until Chapter 6, which might end up being just completely different on the weird route. And maybe that will be the end of the weird route? Particularly with my Chapter 5 pitch, I think the new hometown segment at the end will have something very drastic happen in the weird route. Perhaps being a direct parallel to the sword route segments of Chapter 3, and more than likely using that burning eyes motif that's also in Battle Against a True Hero and Power of Neo. I'm not quite sure where the weird route is going. I'm way less certain on where that whole storyline is heading, but I'm intrigued. And that's basically it from me for this video. This will probably be the only Deltarune video I'll ever make, since Chapter 5 is releasing maybe even less than a day from when I upload this video. I don't know when it'll be finished. And I think trying to speculate too much on the end of the game is a recipe for not fully enjoying what Chapter 6 and 7 will give us. So instead, I want to hear from you. What do you predict will happen in Chapter 5? Have you got any crazy ideas on the same level as Knight Asgore? I'd be definitely curious to hear. It's not long until the chapter comes out anyway, so all our theories will probably be debunked, but just speculating on these kinds of things can be fun. And yeah, I kind of wished I made this video ages ago, because almost everything that I've said in this video are theories and concepts that I just naturally came up with on my own, long before the trailer came out or before a lot of big theory videos started talking about them. So barely anything I've said in this video is quote-unquote original, because now that other people have independently come up with the same ideas as me, this video just seems like a compilation of other people's theories and concepts relating to Chapter 5 and trying to fit them all together or something. When if I actually finished this video earlier, that wouldn't have been a problem, but alas, this is just how things ended up, I guess. So yeah, that's the video, I guess. Really need to figure out how to end videos properly. If you're expecting Deltarune things from me in the future, then don't. Don't expect anything from me ever again.